Okay, guys, today we're talking about the early Mesozoic again, the Triassic and the Jurassic periods, and we're going to get into a little more depth and find out a little bit more about how the dinosaurs came about and sort of some of the other things that happened during those two periods. So let's kind of pick up where we left off, and there's a quiz if you follow along. You can fill that out as you go. Let's take a look to start with at the types of plant life that were abundant during this time period. So I know you've seen pictures and drawings in Jurassic Park and all these movies and things where they show you dinosaurs in, of course, surroundings that have plants in them. Uh, in some of those movies and some of those things have been actually well done. But one of the things that ruins it for me when I'm watching a movie or a video or even seeing a painting of the dinosaurs is when they get the plants wrong, because it's just so doggone obvious, because there were some plants that were not around at the time of the dinosaurs. Um, One thing that was abundant and was pretty much everywhere were the ferns. They were incredibly diverse, way more so than they are today. They were almost, I mean, you might even say they were one of the dominant plants of the landscape. So where you might think of, if you see a picture of a dinosaur, say, standing in tall grass, that wasn't grass. Grass wasn't around. But things like ferns would have really dominated uh, that lower sort of level of plant life, and some of the ferns got humongous. Some of the ferns were tree size. And there are still some tree ferns alive today. But by and large, if we're talking about the plants of this time period, we really have to talk about gymnosperms. Gymnosperms are what we call the naked seed plants. So these are plants that are not angiosperms. They do not flower. Um, in in today's world, in the Cenozoic, if I asked you to go outside and find me a plant, like 98% of whatever you brought me back would be a flowering plant. Even grass is a flowering plant, and it's got very, very tiny flowers. In fact, just about every single tree you would go grab a leaf off of is a flowering plant. They have very tiny flowers. A lot of us are allergic to their pollen. Um, Now, there are some trees that are not flowering plants that are gymnosperms, like, uh, say, pine trees, but pine trees didn't exist during this time. There were some other gymnosperms, though. Um, so, a gymnosperm is a plant that reproduces using a cone, um, or kind of at the end of its short little stalks, like the ginkgo tree does. And some of you might have seen ginkgos before. We plant them around the cities. They're really unique trees. We'll talk a little bit more about those later. But the types of trees that were gymnosperms and plants that were gymnosperms during this time were the cycads. Uh, they they are like really one of the majority of plants, those guys and the ferns that are around during this time, along with the ginkgos. Um, so flowering plants don't really come about till later, and flowering plants have this sort of intricate relationship with the insects. In fact, they co-evolve together with the insects to be what they are. So let's look at one of these cycads. Um, these things are like the main trees of the landscape during the Jurassic. In fact, people call it the age of the cycads because they look, they kind of look like tropical, and a lot of these that are still alive today are they live in tropical areas. They've got this one sort of, they've got these largish cones sort of in their middle section, and some of them were tall trees. The ones surviving today mostly are these sort of smaller, bushy looking, they almost look like a fern, but it's not a fern. They're a lot more rare in the modern world. Some of the other conifers that were around during this time were things like cedars and Douglas firs, cypresses, um, junipers, hemlocks, redwoods, spruces, larches, yews. So some of that would have looked familiar because those plants are around today. And in some respects, a lot of those trees are really living fossils. Like they've been around since the time of the dinosaurs, and they've changed very little since then. But no pine trees had yet come about. So a lot of these trees, like the larch there, it loses its needles in the wintertime. You see the beautiful yellow foliage there on that one that's about to lose its needles. Um, but they're not pine trees. They're a little bit different. So some of the things would look familiar, some of the things would not have. Um, Definitely, ginkgo trees would have been unique in the fact that we don't have a lot of these anymore. So out of all the species, and there were a lot of different species of ginkgos during the time the dinosaurs were around, they all went extinct except for one. And so there's just one species left. And if I remember right, it was actually rediscovered in China, and it's not a North American species at all. We actually planted it here, and those of you guys that know something about the ginkgo know that there's a male and a female tree, and bad things happen if you plant the female trees because they make this fruit that just smells essentially like hot vomit. It is just a terrible, terrible smell. If you want something nasty, put a bag of those fruits in the back of your car on a hot day, and you will definitely smell something. Um, but anyway, ginkgos they just look like the land before time. If you happen to go to the IU campus and you're walking around out in some of the forested regions of the IU campus, you might see some really gymongous female ginkgo trees because they can get really quite huge. Um, so they do shed their leaves in the fall, like hardwood trees do, and their leaves turn this beautiful, beautiful yellow color. We plant them in the streets today. You'll see them around Columbus even, just the male trees. Usually they're pretty small. They don't usually let them get very big before they cut them down and plant a new one. But what we found out is that they're very resilient to pollution, modern air pollution. I guess they must be because they've survived through some pretty nasty events, right? Um, but yeah, they're real resistant to pollution, beautiful trees. It's honestly, this is my favorite tree. I could just talk about it for hours. So I'll probably stop. But those are fossil ginkgo leaves on the right, and there's a modern leaf on the left there. It kind of looks like a whale's tail. The two species are not exactly the same, but they're same genus, definitely ginkgos. Anyway, let's turn now to a group of organisms that survived on into the Triassic and Jurassic. Um, these things survived that Permian extinction, so they managed to get through the Great Dying that we spoke of last time. These are the Thoraxids, and they represent a really unique group of creatures, and the most important thing about them really is that these things are what go on to be the branch that the mammals come off of. And you and I are mammals, so that's why we care about that, right? So the mammals branched off of, the mammals are descendants of the ancient Thoraxid line. What was the Thoraxid? These things were, they were reptiles, essentially. Uh, they were kind of strange looking a little bit. If you look at their legs in particular, notice that they're oriented a little bit more underneath their body than a typical reptile leg would be, but they're not perfectly underneath. Remember, we talked last time about gaits and patterns, and the way organisms walk and how fast they can move based on where their legs are. So these aren't fully erect walkers. Their legs kind of jut out to the sides a little bit and then kind of point down. Um, and then from this line evolved the mammals that all become essentially really vertical legs, like right underneath of the bodies. So we'll see that happen for the mammals. These things were dominant during the Triassic. They almost went extinct. We're not going to talk too much about the Triassic-Jurassic extinction, but there was another extinction event that occurred right between the Triassic and the Jurassic. And these things, they almost got wiped out. And it's quite possible that their nearly going extinct kind of paved the way for the mammals to really kind of spring out here. So let's kind of move forward here to the mammals. So kind of near the end of the Triassic, right before the big extinction there, the mammals come about. They evolved from the Thoraxids, and these are some cynodonts. They kind of look, at least that they're always sort of drawn like weirdish sort of half dog, half reptile looking sort of things. They weren't very big. They didn't get much bigger than, like, say, a house cat. They were most likely scavengers, feeding on dead animals like you see there. They lived most likely underground, ate in burrows. So you can kind of see how something like this might be able to survive in impact, being a scavenger, um, not being a specialist, uh, hiding in the shadows, being nocturnal, living underground. This is early mammals right here. And when you look at these creatures, how they're drawn, you do kind of get that feeling a little bit like, am I looking at a mammal or am I looking at a reptile? Because mammals are descended from that group of reptiles, right? So anyway, the takeaway is that the Thoraxids are what give rise to the mammals. And they really pretty much remain small and peripheral. They were not major players during the Mesozoic. It wasn't till the dinosaurs go extinct at the end that we really get our start. Um, Now, why didn't they take over? Well, one reason might have just kind of been the timing, because mammals have a lot of really unique, useful features that are like pave the way for them to rule the world, right? Like we dominate today. One reason may just simply be that the dinosaurs just so happened to evolve earlier than the mammals did. So they sort of just got a head start on us. And they took over and they filled in all the niches, like all the large creatures, all the small creatures, everything in between. It was pretty much taken over by the dinos. So enter in to the age of the dinosaurs. But remember, as we're talking, mammals, early mammals are living alongside the dinosaurs. Obviously not hominids, not people. We're not there with the dinosaurs, but early mammals are living alongside the dinosaurs through much of this, just kind of like in the shadows, if you will. Okay, so here's a famous painting of the dinosaurs here in the time period, and I like the fact they got most of the trees right there. Um, they've got some stuff going on. Got two apparently crocodilian-looking things sort of fighting there in the background. Most pictures of the fossil record, whether it's dinosaurs or the Permian or whatever you want to talk about, are kind of overblown with too much life going on in them. Like if you go out in nature today, you're not going to see every imaginable creature, right? They're all going to hide from you. But when we draw a picture or paint a picture, we like to put everything in it so it looks like there's a lot of stuff going on. So it's kind of misleading us sometimes when you look at some of the paintings of the dinosaurs. So where did the dinosaurs come from? Well, just like the mammals, they're an offshoot from some reptiles. So if you go back all the way, let's kind of take it from the early beginnings here. Take it from the fishes, because we know the fishes. Of course, that's where the lung develops. That's where the tetrapod, the four-legged sort of thing, comes from. The arm, the hand, like all those things come about. Like all the bone structure comes about in the fish. And then from the fishes, we end up with these early tetrapods that are like salamander-like amphibians that live part in the water, part on land. And from those types of creatures, we end up with reptiles that are fully land-living, can lay eggs, can be far away from water. If we continue tracing that lineage, we end up with one offshoot going off towards the mammals and another offshoot going off towards what we call the Dinosaur Morphs. So these things are the ancestors to crocodiles, pterodactyls, dinosaurs, and of course the birds, which I put in parentheses there because birds are dinosaurs, like full on. Birds are classified in the clade Dinosauria. They are as dinosaur gets. They are the living descendants of a group of dinosaurs. So crocodiles and pterodactyls, not dinosaurs, okay? Dinosaurs and birds, similar thing. So just so you kind of separate that out. But anyway, the dinosaur morphs, these things that look like, sort of like early dinosaurs, are what give rise to these three groups. And then they all go off sort of in their own separate directions. But let's take a look at some of the characteristics of this early dinosaur morph here. This is Lagosuchus. I think is how you say it. He's about a foot tall, so not a very large critter here. Take a look at the legs in particular. Look at the shortened like forelimbs. It's got those like T-Rex arms going on there. You might notice the complexity going on in the ankle joint that's happening there. Okay. Some other things to notice in particular are its legs are inserted underneath of the body. Like this really has these very upright, straight extending down legs. They don't jut out to the sides before they go down, or just go right out to the sides, like in the case of, say, like crocodiles and alligators, and those early Thoracids. But these things are fast movers. They've got legs directly underneath the hips, and they can probably move. Some of them even got up most likely on two legs and moved around. So dinosaur morphs give rise to the three groups: crocodiles, pterodactyls, and the dinosaurs, which includes the birds. Okay, the early dinosaurs really, they first resembled the dinosaur morphs in that they could run on two legs, but they had much more developed teeth than the dinosaur morphs. We've got a picture here to give you an idea. When we look there, I've got a chicken, which of course is related to this group of dinosaurs that you're looking at here, and a dog there. This is one of the earlier known dinosaurs. Probably was a really agile predator, strong claws. That thing was a hunter for sure. About 10 feet long, 3 meters during the late Triassic. So the dinosaurs as an entire group, we can kind of start to hone in on some characteristics. It's hard to create a list of exactly perfect characteristics that describes every single dinosaur, but there are some things that are pretty unique to most dinosaurs, comparing them to other things that were alive at the time. So let's look at a skeleton here of a dinosaur, and you'll notice, as I mentioned before, their ankles are pretty advanced. Like they can really rotate and move those ankles around. It's not just a stump. Their hind limb, super erect gait. Notice how the hip, the femur there, that top bone of the leg, fits right into that socket joint there in the hip, just right underneath of it. So that's really going to allow this thing not only to stand up on two legs, but to move pretty rapidly with its feet right underneath of it on land. The other big characteristic you'll notice here, and I mentioned this earlier, is that their forelimbs, their front arms there, are less than half the length of the hind limb. And that's not perfectly true for every single dinosaur, but if you look at all of them, you're going to see that their front limbs are considerably shorter than their rear limbs. Like it's noticeable. So when we look at the whole tree here of these groups, and this is just one way to lay this out. Obviously, there's still some debate as to where we put things, but overall, paleontologists classify two large main groups of dinosaurs. There's what's called the ornithischians, which all happen to be herbivores. In other words, they ate plants. That's that whole group there to the left branch of the tree. And then there's the saurischians that were really the first to come about, but those are the ones that branch off towards the birds. So let's kind of take a look at some of these groups here. You'll notice that at the very bottom base of the tree there is the Dinosauromorpha. So those early things that were kind of dinosaurish-like reptiles. And then we finally hit actual Dinosauria, which was the picture I showed you of that first dinosaur there. And it obviously looks a lot more like the saurischians, and it kind of goes off that direction. These two groups are classed based on how their hips look, and it's confusing because the bird-hipped ones are not the ones that lead to the birds. The lizard-hipped ones are the ones that lead to the birds. So that's just what it is, okay? But looking at those, you'll probably recognize some shapes there. You might recognize a Stegosaurus-y looking thing over there that's towards the bird-hipped ones. You might recognize that guy there at the top, Ornithopoda, as one. We're going to talk about that here in a second. And we've got Triceratops looking guy up there. So some of those will be kind of familiar to you, but going the other direction, up through the saurischians, you've got the sauropods, those giant lumbering monsters. You've got the tyrannosaurs, up there, and of course the birds, all branching up that direction. The aves is the birds. So when we say that birds are dinosaurs, we mean that quite literally. They are the direct descendants of a group of dinosaurs known as the theropods. Okay, that's what branches off, and that is what T-Rex was a part of, that group. And they are alive today, very much so. Okay, let's move on here and talk a little bit about what made the dinosaurs such a successful group. There's a lot of things that we could kind of list. I put together a list of what I think are the main things that allowed them to be so doggone successful. I mean, obviously, arising before mammals, that was helpful, because mammals are pretty tough critters. Like, we're pretty quality stuff here. But some other things, their upper legs being underneath their bodies, underneath their hips, allowed them to move very rapidly. We also know now that they had a very high metabolism, maybe like that of mammals or even birds, where that would have allowed them to move very rapidly. We are quite certain now at this point that they were warm-blooded, and we'll talk more about that here in a second. Another thing that probably helped out the dinosaurs, and this might be a biggie, was that the end Triassic extinction. So at the end of the Triassic, right before the Jurassic, there's an extinction that decimates the Thoraxids, right? Those are the things, of course, that gave rise to the mammals. It wipes these things out. They were really the dominant creature at the time. Like, they kind of ruled things. And so it's funny because you kind of see this thing of, the Thoraxids get wiped out, and then that allows the dinosaurs to take over. The dinosaurs get wiped out, and that allows the mammals to take over. Let's hope that we don't get wiped out, and I don't know, maybe the birds will take over, So, like, it's like this long history through the fossil record of when one dominant creature gets annihilated by an extinction event, the next one up just says, okay, it's my turn, and here we go. And that tends to happen, and there's probably some really good reasons for that, and I'll throw one at you, and that's the fact that the longer a group is around for, typically the more specialized it gets. Organisms tend to grow larger and more specialized, so their requirements for life are pretty exacting. So when there's something like an impact event or a major climate change, those creatures are at greater risk, and the small generalists that are kind of in the background are what survive and then become the next specialists. And we see that over and over again in the fossil record. It's definitely a warning to be aware of. So anyway, I wrote there the Thoraxids probably suppressed the dinosaurs, and both of those were holding the poor mammals down. So when they were all out of the way, we took over, right? But we do know that after the Triassic-Jurassic extinction that knocked out those Thoraxids, dinosaurs really diversify rapidly. Okay. Another thing that was unique to this time is that all land, Pangea, all the continents fit together like puzzle pieces, was currently together, had come together at the time of the dinosaurs. So that meant that if dinosaurs evolved in one location, they could spread everywhere across the entire globe very rapidly. There were no oceans in the way because all the land was connected. And these facts here really are probably what led to dinosaurs being able to rule the world for about 140 million years. That's a long time, right? So let's turn now to dinosaur misconceptions. What are some things that you've heard about dinosaurs that we just know are not correct? So we're changing a lot more of this now, and I think folks are starting to realize a lot of things, even the general public. When I was a kid, we watched, of course, Fred Flintstone ride a brontosaurus or whatever the heck that sauropod is supposed to be there, eat brontosaurus burgers. So obviously, humans, hominids, never lived at the same time as something like a brontosaurus or T-Rex or any of the dinosaurs other than the birds that you might ever think of, right? We were not around during this time. So there's no way that humans were riding on dinos' backs. Yet people still to this day try to create this misconception and say that it was going on like that. I don't know what to do. Really don't know what to do. We've got people who think the Earth is flat, people who think masks don't work. I'm at a loss here, guys. We did not ride dinosaurs, though. So if you learn nothing else, please walk away with that one, okay? Let's talk about another misconception, speed. It was not that long ago that scientists assumed that dinosaurs were just these big lumbering creatures that really couldn't move too fast. And then a lot changed that led to our understanding that this is really not the case. Dinosaurs were not these big hulking lumbering beasts that couldn't move around. The fact of the matter is that dinosaurs had their legs positioned firmly underneath their bodies, right? As we understand now, they were warm-blooded. These things were movers. They could get it. Take a look at that ostrich there on the right. Remember, the ostrich is related to the dinosaurs. The ostrich is clade Dinosauria. Think about how fast those things are. I put an ostrich up there because it's flightless and because it's large, and it gives you an idea maybe of how a dinosaur would have moved. And in fact, we do look at things like ostriches to try and understand how dinosaurs actually did move. But they are very, very fast. Crocodiles, on the other hand, yeah, they can move fast for short distances. They can make very fast bursts. You can't outrun one of these things, even on land. But you could definitely win it in a long-term, like, marathon, right? It would have no chance against you. But look at how its semi-erect posture is there. Its legs go out at kind of an angle, and then they drop back down. Yeah, it can hoist itself up and move fast, but not long periods of time. So we've got a lot of great information that confirms this for us, and we're going to mess with some of that in lab, hopefully. We can measure the length of distances between their tracks, because we have track patterns that have been fossilized, and so we can kind of figure out based on their tracks how fast they were actually moving. And boy, they could move fast, like really fast, and then it confirms that for us. What's another misconception? Another misconception is that dinosaurs were all huge. Dinosaurs were not huge. In fact, they were so ubiquitous, they were everywhere in the environment. Lots of them were tiny. There were some in between. Of course, there were some that were gigantic. Some of these things were like bunny rabbit size, like this little guy here, Microceratops. Get it? Microceratops. He was maybe about 2 feet long. Wasn't very big at all. But yeah, they didn't have to be humongous to be a dinosaur. Like, that wasn't on the characteristic list. So got all sorts of shapes and sizes. They literally filled in every niche available to them. Okay, so dinosaurs. Reptiles, ruling reptiles. I know you've probably heard that before. Dinosaurs are technically not reptiles. Okay, so you got to get that in your head. A dinosaur is something unique from a reptile, just as a mammal is something unique from a reptile. So I know that both of those groups, both dinosaurs and both mammals, are descendants of the reptiles. Heck, the reptiles are descendants from the amphibians, but they're not an amphibian, right? Amphibians are descendants from fish, but they ain't fish. So it's okay, right? So I know that we draw many of them as reptile-like in our drawings of them and our recreations, and they probably were very reptile-like in a lot of ways. But they were also pretty bird-like in a lot of ways. They were their own unique thing. And in fact, now as we're doing more and more drawings of the dinosaurs, you're going to see modern recreations look far more like birds than they do really like reptiles. And there's a lot of characteristics of a bird that look like a reptile. When you look close at it, it's got little claws. The things have scales, right? And now, as we know, T-Rex and a lot of its relatives had feathers. So just about every drawing you've ever seen of T-Rex is undoubtedly wrong. If that doesn't ruin your day, I don't know what will. But yeah, try not to think of T-Rex as being unfeathered. At least the babies certainly had feathers. We don't know if they kept them into adulthood. But another big difference here is that reptiles are cold-blooded. In other words, they're ectothermic. So when When it gets cold out, they slow down. They can't keep moving. They don't keep their body at a temperature. Dinosaurs, birds, mammals, we all regulate our body temperature. So if it gets cold outside, yeah, we might feel cold, but we can keep moving. If you throw a snake outside in the snow, it's not going to move very far before it can't move, right? So it's a big difference between the groups. Let's look now at at reproduction. So this little talk came out of a question that I had one time, which I realized was actually a rather big question that a lot of students had, but were kind of embarrassed to ask. So we're going to talk the birds and bees of the dinosaurs. Get it, the birds? So in many ways, dinosaurs reproduced, we think, very similar to the way that birds do it. So if you don't know how birds reproduce, here you go. So most birds reproduce really similar to a lot of reptiles in the fact they have this thing called a cloaca. So you've got a picture down there of a newt, and you can see the rear end there underneath the tail. That's its cloaca, and what will happen is it will swell up with blood, and then it will find a female, and the female also has one of these, and then they'll perform what's known as a cloacal kiss. And so once it swells up like that, the sperm passes out of that thing and then into the other cloaca, and the fertilization hopefully takes place. So it's a little different than mammals today do this. And more than likely, the earliest mammals reproduced this way as well. And we've got some interesting examples of this because, for instance, marsupials in monotremes, like the duck-billed platypus or the kangaroo, these things retain parts of that feature in a way. In fact, some of them lay eggs, right? The monotremes lay eggs. The duck-billed platypus, the spiny anteater, they're mammals that actually lay eggs, like we think that most of the dinosaurs probably did. They probably laid eggs. We've got examples of them actually sitting on their eggs, like the oviraptor there, brooding. Like you can kind of make that out there. The skeleton was fossilized right on top of the eggs that it was trying to keep warm. So another good example there of that thing was warm-blooded, because otherwise it's not going to keep its eggs warm by sitting on them, right? It's something that warm-blooded creatures do. So yeah, I know this is kind of strange, but earliest mammals probably started out the same way. It's somewhere down the line, the more modern method of like having a penis and reproducing that way developed. And yes, there are birds that actually have that appendage as well. It's not quite the same as a mammal sort of situation, but there's some like geese and swans and ducks, and the ostrich does as well. It's not quite the same thing. So there's kind of lots of ways reproduction can happen, and more than likely, even though those parts don't fossilize, the dinosaurs were reproducing much like most of the birds do today. Like we know that many of them laid eggs, so it's very possible that this is how this happened. Okay, enough about the birds and the bees. So let's go on to, were dinosaurs solitary or were dinosaurs social? Turns out that many dinosaurs, I'm surely not all, like there's so many exceptions in biology and paleontology, like it's almost hard to make a hard and fast rule in biology, but many dinosaurs traveled in herds, and we have evidence of this in their tracks. They definitely were walking together in groups, and so there was some sort of community that was built there. In fact, the duck-billed dinosaurs no doubt had a means of communication through this giant resonating chamber that they had in their heads. So I know you've probably seen pictures of these in books about dinosaurs, but the duckbills are just some really cool looking creatures. They've got this big horn-shaped thing coming off the back of their head, and if you look at it, under an x-ray, you can actually see that it's got this crazy convoluted chamber that basically starts at their snout and wraps all around back there through this rotated little structure. What scientists did was they took the heads off of these things and they made a cast of what an internal mold of what that was, and they recreated some like perfect replicas of the skulls, and then they hooked them up to various air compressors and blew air through that thing to see if it would make any noises. And sure enough, this thing definitely makes some noises. So I'm going to let you hear what that sounds like. Now keep in mind that this is probably not what it really sounded like, but is a really good example, a demonstration at least, of the fact that it definitely was a structure that was used to make some sort of noise. Probably during the dinosaur time, there was just a cacophony of sounds. Like you could imagine sitting out there in these primeval looking forests of fern trees and cycads and hearing just the sounds that are coming off of these things. Remember, birds are descended from these things, and birds are noisy as heck. So you can imagine the squealing and the squalling and the squawking and the weird noises. But anyway, here's what happened when they hooked this thing up to an air compressor just to see what would go on. Isn't that great? All right, that's probably enough of that. So another misconception that I kind of grew up learning, that we were just finding out about when I was a kid and excited about dinosaurs myself, is that dinosaurs were endothermic. And what that means is that they were warm-blooded, if that makes more sense to you. They had a very high rate of metabolism, and they kept an elevated body temperature just like we do with our environment. So even though it's cold outside, birds, mammals, dinosaurs maintain a constant body temperature, and that allows us to be tremendously successful, right? We can continue to be active and to do things and to run fast and to move fast even when it gets cold out. A reptile can't pull that off. Reptiles get cold, they need to hibernate, they slow down, their metabolism can't keep up. So very different understanding of the dinosaurs to recognize them. This is no small thing as endothermic. So really put some more securely in the group of creatures like birds and mammals. Now, how do we know this? What's the evidence for this? There is a crazy amount of evidence that dinosaurs were endothermic. And I'm going to go through a bunch of it here just because I think it's really cool. So what do we know? Well, the trackways give us a very strong piece of evidence here. They show us that they were moving around an awful lot in daily life, like too much to be cold-blooded. Modern endotherms tend to trot around rather than walk even when they're moving. They tend to move pretty fast. So dinosaurs were likely endothermic because they didn't really dawdle. They moved around pretty quickly. That's an endothermic metabolism right there. They took long strides for their foot length. Like mammals do, they stretched their leg out far. They used a lot of energy to move. Reptiles don't tend to do that. Cold-blooded creatures don't. We also see in their bones, there's a large abundance of tubes for the blood vessels. So blood vessels don't fossilize, but the places where the blood vessels flowed through the bones do. In modern bird, modern mammal bones have these similar type of blood vessels. Reptiles don't have nearly as many. They have a much slower metabolism. Also, that picture I showed you of the brooding of the eggs, that's an endothermic thing. Creatures that are ectothermic, that are cold-blooded, they don't sit on their eggs and warm them. They're not warm, so what good is that going to do, right? You lay your eggs and you slither away and hope for the best. So brooding is a very endothermic behavior. There is more evidence. So dinosaurs very likely would have been unable to keep the mammal down. Like for 140 million years, mammals are some pretty killer things. I mean, like we're powerful creatures. Mammals are. It didn't take much for us to rise to dominance. Um, but if dinosaurs were cold-blooded, it's very unlikely they would have been able to suppress the mammal evolution like they did, right? So we have to assume that dinosaurs definitely had the endurance and the power to run down those early mammals and snack on them. Another thing is that ectotherm populations today consist of about 40% predators. Okay, they don't need, or they require less food to sustain themselves. Okay, so in dinosaur communities, predators only made up of about 10% of the community. So you can't have as many predators if you need more food to feed them. So you can just look at the relative abundance of predators versus herbivores, and you can kind of make an estimate of, how many, of whether or not the community is warm-blooded or cold-blooded. And it turns out that dinosaurs have the right amount there to have definitely fallen within the warm-blooded range. Also, we see that carnivores are pretty rare in today's mammal communities. The endotherms require lots of food to maintain that metabolism. It's kind of what we were just talking about there. To have carnivores are usually more towards the top of the food chain. They need a lot of creatures lower on the food chain to maintain themselves. And so we see that in dinosaur communities when we look at the fossil record. Now let's look at their nests. So when we look at dinosaur nests, they show that dinosaurs were growing really rapidly. They might have hatched at a few inches, and then they would grow up to like 5 feet by the end of the summer. They'd get very large. To grow that fast, that's an endothermic thing. Things like crocodiles and even big tortoises that we might compare as reptiles, they don't grow as fast as that. So definitely seems like there's a faster metabolism going on here. When we look at their leg bones, we can look at the growth bands, which show us like how fast they were growing and how large they were. That shows us that creatures like T-Rex were attaining a weight of like a half ton before it was even 13 years old. So that is way faster than large reptiles put on weight. These things had a quick metabolism. They must have been eating a lot of food. Then finally, I mean, this is the smoking gun here. We start to see, we've found feathers on some dinosaurs that were not there for flight, but were there for insulation. So feathers in birds, one of their main purposes is to help keep the bird warm. So those feathers on the dinosaurs, boy, that is like a smoking gun that these things had to be endothermic, had to be warm-blooded. Now we can also look at the oxygen isotopes, which tell us a little bit about their body temperature in the bones when they were secreted, and those are really similar between both dinosaurs and mammals. So like every single piece of evidence now that we're looking at here is pointing towards the fact that dinosaurs, as a group, most of them, had to be endothermic, right? So I don't want to give you the impression that they all were, though, because it's probably also quite possible that there were some groups of dinosaurs that were exothermic, that were cold-blooded. In fact, some of these isotopic studies of the oxygen actually show that some of the groups maybe were not warm-blooded. Now, the group that gave rise to the birds, the one that includes T-Rex and all those guys, that group was undoubtedly warm-blooded. But there probably were some groups that were not, right? Dinosaurs are a very diverse group of creatures. The final bit of evidence here I'll throw at you is that when we look at the diversity of dinosaurs, especially down near the South Pole, which is where Australia was at during the Cretaceous, which is sort of the end times of the dinosaurs, there was just a huge diversity down there. And it was definitely a cold climate because it was near the South Pole, and the plants also tell us that, like the glacial deposits tell us that. Only an endothermic animal would have been able to survive in that climate, like in that type of diversity. So these things had to have had an endothermic nature. They had to have been warm-blooded. And in fact, like when we look at their body mass and how large they got and how quick they got, Tyrannosaurus grew much larger because it could grow so fast at a rate between the age of like 10 to 20 years. It was putting on most of its mass. And we can figure that out just by looking at the layers and the bones there, which is what that picture is showing you. So they really boomed up pretty quick there. Okay, so that's the evidence for warm-bloodedness, otherwise known as endothermy. And let's move on to talking about some of the groups, because that's what's fun. So Stegosaurus was an ornithischian, was, of course, one of the bird-hipped ones, had a very small brain. The dinosaurs as a group had small brains compared to body size. I don't want to belittle them because that doesn't mean that they weren't smart. They were incredibly intelligent creatures, I would assume. But as far as brain size to body size, they ain't got nothing on a primate, that's for sure, right? Or even a mammal like a mouse. So smallish brain, and sometimes you hear the famous or infamous saying that their brain was the size of a walnut. Not really true. I mean, it just depends on how you look at it. We were not really sure like how much of their brain case was filled with brain. So what have they got there? There's some features of this guy I wanted to point out. Stegosaurs had many of the, as a group, there's a lot of different dinosaurs that fell into this group. They had this spiky thing on their tail for protection, so they could swing that around and knock into something that might want to attack them. But the unique feature of the stegosaur is all those plates along its back. And there's been so much debate about what those things were for. It's kind of unique. But I think we finally arrived at a model where we think that the plates were more for thermal regulation and maybe even mating. Because what we found is there's all these little blood vessels that run through those plates. So it would have been a really effective method of either cooling or warming yourself, because all you would really need to do is turn those plates towards the sun, and you could easily warm things up really fast for your body because of all the blood vessels in those. It's also possible that they could have flushed blood into those and changed the color of them a little bit and used them for a mating display. Oftentimes when we see creatures who have a giant superfluous thing sticking off their backs, that's oftentimes for mating. Like a lot of males of species will have these giant things just to attract females. So many of these guys weighed in at around like 4.5 metric tons. They were herbivores like all those bird-hipped dinosaurs were. So they needed ways to protect themselves, like with that big spike on the tail there, like Ankylosaurus and all those dinosaurs. Let's turn now to some of the largest creatures that have ever lived on land. The sauropods. Sauropods are a huge group of dinosaurs. Huge, in fact, they're giant. There's also a lot of different types of them. In fact, Brontosaurus is one of these. And you might remember a few years back, probably 10, 15 years now, they decided that it wasn't its own group and they got rid of it. And then they finally brought back the Brontosaurus after they discovered they had made a mistake. It's easy to do in the fossil record, right? It's hard to say, is this a new group or is it part of an existing species? And we constantly move stuff around, but that doesn't mean we don't understand things and we don't have things right. It just means we're still working out a lot of the little details. Let's talk about sauropods, though, as a group. These things, some of them just got humongous. And you can see, look at their necks. The titanosaurs, which are a group of sauropods, those things got up to like 90 to 100 metric tons. That's the biggest land mammal of all time. Like there has been, the elephant has nothing on this. They are humongous. They aren't, however, the largest creature of all time. The largest creature of all time would in fact be the blue whale. We'll talk about him here in a second. But sauropods are by far and away the largest animal that has ever lived on land that we know of. Their necks are so long and crazy looking that they're supported almost like suspension bridges with these massively thick spines and these really rope-like ligaments. Now, the ligaments don't preserve, but we can see where the grooves where the ligaments ran in, so we know that their necks were literally like suspension bridges. The sauropod, the name means reptile feet, and so when I was a kid, they thought that these things were just big lumbering monsters that couldn't really move about very fast. But remember, we hadn't really accepted that dinosaurs were warm-blooded yet. In fact, most paleontologists assumed that the only way this thing could have survived at all, the size of it, would be to float in some water someplace, like in a lake or an ocean or something. So they assumed they just kind of walked along the bottom of the ocean or the bottom of a lake. And we now know that's not true. These things were land-dwelling. In fact, many studies have been done to show that if that was underwater, the depth that it would have been submerged to, it would not have been able to inflate its lungs. Like, it would not have had enough strength in its muscles to move its diaphragm to fill its lungs with air if that body was submerged to the depth of just the head sticking out of the water. So plenty of evidence there that this thing could not have been a water-dwelling creature sticking its neck out like a snorkel. Although that's how all the early drawings of these guys were. Now, let's talk for a second here about just how big is big. How big could something get and still live on land? Well, the sauropods push that upper limit pretty much to the max of what we think is possible. Now, I hate to give an upper limit of anything in biology or paleontology, because as soon as you do, a fossil is found or a creature is found that proves you wrong. So let's make some generalizations here and say that this is what we think. Is there an upper limit to size? We think, just based on some simple mathematics here, at somewhere around about 140 tons, metric tons, the legs would have to be so wide to support that body mass that they would start to touch, and they would be so close together that the animal wouldn't actually be able to walk, like that giant Lego picture on the top right there. The legs eventually become so large to support all that weight that there's no longer any way for it to move. And if it can't move, it can't eat, and so probably can't live. So that's our assumption anyway. But as you go up this graph here, we can kind of maybe make a guess at that theoretical mass being somewhere around 140 metric tons. The largest mammal in the world, largest animal in the world, which is a mammal, is the blue whale, and it lives in the ocean. So the constraints in the ocean are a little bit different than they are on land, because you're just floating, right? All that blubber, it's just floating. It doesn't have to support its body like you do on land. Now, some of these titanosaurs I told you, these sauropods, got up to about 100 metric tons. That is darn near close to the absolute limit we think something could be in terms of size. So way to go, biology, always pushing the limits right to their very edge. And maybe we'll find one that's bigger at some point in time. In fact, when they discovered that titanosaur, the first one, they thought that what they had found was a species of tree. And later on, during the excavation, they realized that the tree trunk was actually a leg bone. So that's how big these things are, right? They're humongous. Let's look at another group, though, another really famous group that branched off from that branch that the dinosaurs branched off of. The pterosaurs. The pterodactyl, right? This is a whole group, though. The pterodactyl was just one of them. These things were reptiles. They were not birds. They were not dinosaurs. They were reptilian, and they did fly. Could they have taken off from the ground? Not really sure. They definitely could have jumped off a cliff and glided and soared on thermals and come back to the cliff. Look at the teeth on that gnarly thing. Those are some teeth that are designed for catching things like fish. Look at those spiky, kind of jagged-looking, crazy teeth. But really unique-looking creature. It's got a crest on its head. Many similarities to birds, but yet not related to birds. Remember, time and time again we see in biology this convergent evolution where two groups will converge on the same features through different evolutionary paths. So, yeah, it's possible for this thing to look like a bird and not be a bird, right? It's possible that you can have two creatures occupying a similar niche that are not related, that might look the same. So reptiles, anyway, what do we know about these guys? Well, they had these long wings covered by a membrane of skin, not feathers. They had hollow bones like birds do. Some of them had really long tails. Many of them had this sort of a furry covered coat. The hair that they had was made up of this stuff we call pycnofibers. It was hair-like, but it doesn't share a common ancestry with mammalian hair. So their hair was not similar to our hair. It was a different evolutionary path that gave them this hairy-like covering that they have. The pterosaurs probably would flap their wings to help take off if they could from the ground. We're not really sure. But once they were airborne, much like a kite, they could just soar in the wind and hit those thermals and just float up and probably go all over the place like a modern-day hang glider might do. They appear to have been able to walk just fine. They had these sort of hook-like claws that they could have probably used to climb, so maybe they could climb up cliffs to fly off. Maybe they lived on the sides of cliffs. Maybe they could climb trees. There's a lot we don't know, and there were a lot of different species, but definitely a really unique, very cool group of creatures that lived at this time. Let's turn now to the last group that we really need to talk about, the only surviving members of the clade Dinosauria, the birds. Here's a photo of some of the very first birds. Archaeopteryx there, the fossil on your right, and the redrawing there, the recreation on the left there. You've got a little nest in the nook of a tree, and this thing's climbing up. This thing had these big, huge, like very modern day looking feathers. These things are not just for insulation. Like those things are obviously somehow for gliding or pumping your body to move fast. They're distinctive features. What are some other weird things about this? This thing is a relative of those theropod dinosaurs. It is a relative of T-Rex and his and her brethren. These are the first birds that come about during the late Jurassic. It's almost like when you look at it, it's got a skeleton of a dinosaur, but it's got a bird covering over that skeleton. When you look close at the skeleton, you notice there's some features that are not bird-like. It's got teeth, like sharp, pointy teeth, if you could see up close there. I know its head's arched back. It's got sharp, pointy claws extending out its digits that are sticking out the edges of its wings. Look at that. You see the picture there. It's climbing up the tree with those things. It didn't have a breastbone, which if you think about, say, a chicken, if you eat chicken breast, that's like where all the meat is, right, on the chicken. So all that meat that's on the breastbone, that meat is there not just for people to eat, but it's there to flap your wings. It's there to move those appendages. So birds that fly have really big breast meat there. And so this thing didn't have a bone to attach that to. So it was more dinosaurian than it was like even more modern birdy. It was probably a very clumsy flyer, probably had pretty weak muscles there, but definitely the first bird. Like you definitely look at that and you're like, man, look at those feathers. That thing is a bird. But yeah, think back to the fact that this thing is related to the theropods that included T-Rex and some of the largest land predators that have ever lived, and they are still with us today. Okay, well, that's it. Hope you enjoyed today's talk. Go ahead and submit your lesson there, and you're all done for the day.